Hello everybody. So we'll continue now on the lecture about international migration, and here I will discuss specifically this topic related to immigration to the United States. So let's just go to slide 32 to start on this topic. So around 98.5% of US residents are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. So based on data from 2010, about 1.5% only of the US residents did not self-identify as immigrants or descendants of immigrants. And those mostly are formed by American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. So only 4.2 million out of the all US residents did not self-identify as immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Immigrants of other countries are mostly migrant workers and rarely become citizens. So in other countries that receive a lot of immigrants, such as the United Arab Emirates, in which 84% of the population is foreign-born, migrants have restricted rights and rarely become permanent immigrants. And that's not the case of the US. So the US receives most immigrants of all the countries in the world. We saw in previous slides around 46 million in 2013. And this 46 million is pretty much 14% of the US population. This fraction is smaller than in other countries. It's smaller than in the United Arab Emirates, for example, and also in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But one interesting characteristic of immigrants in the US is that they usually have more rights and they usually have more chances of becoming permanent immigrants compared to immigrants in other countries that are rarely, they have really low chances of becoming citizens. And the number of immigrants and immigrants as percentage of the US population from 1850 to 2012, it's shown in this graph here. So we see these green bars, green columns here, that the overall number of immigrants in millions, they increase from 1850 to the 1930s and then decline up to 1970 and then increased again, and then it reached nowadays around a little over 40 million of the population. But if we consider the size of the American population as a whole, so it's important to also see the percentage of this foreign-born population, taking into account the size of the whole US population. In terms of percentage, it declined until around the 1970s, increased, and then kind of like remained constant in this last decade. So now around 13% of the US population is formed by foreign-born people. So this is just to show that we see a lot of variation in the 70s. The US really, even in total numbers and in percentage numbers, we see a decline of immigrants, and then it increased again in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but now in these last years it has become more stable. This figure here comes from another article that I added to this discussion in our lecture, and this graph here comes from our textbook, and it shows pretty much the same trend. So in terms of the total foreign-born population in millions, kind of like increase up to 1930s, decline in 1970, and then increase again up to 2010. And in terms of percentage, we see a huge drop in 1970, as we saw in the previous figure, and then it starts increasing again. And as we saw in the previous figure, after 2010, this number here kind of like stabilized around 13%. And in terms of country of birth of immigrants in the US, it has changed a lot since the mid-1800s. So the the character of US immigration has changed since the mid-1800s. The origin locations of immigrants to the US have changed dramatically. So, for example, in 1960, 75% of the US foreign-born were born in Europe. Now, by 2010, this percentage declined to only 12%, so declining from 75 to 12% in these 50 years between 1960 and 2010. And this table here kind of summarizes that information. So from 1820 until around 1929, we see that the biggest numbers of immigrants coming to the US, they were from Northwestern Europe and also from Southeast Europe. And then these numbers here are like raw numbers. So we see 1.2 million of immigrants in the US between 1920 to 1929. They were from Northwest Europe. And what you see after that, after the 30s, is that you see a decline in the number of immigrants coming from Europe, and then you see an increase of immigrants coming from Latin America, and also from Asia, and even from Africa. In Africa in more recent years. So you see it doubles the number of Africans coming to the US between 1990 and 1999, and then from 2000 to 2009 here. But still these numbers are smaller in total than the ones coming from Latin America and from Asia. And these numbers of Latin Americans and Asians coming to the US in more recent years, it's now higher than those coming from Europe. And here is the percentage of the foreign-born population overall in the US. So it increased up to 1900s, 1900 to 1909, and then it declined, and then now increased again. And as we saw in previous graphs, it has been kind of stable in these last years, around 13%. So this information here breaks down the region of origin of immigrants in the US. It shows this clear pattern of more immigration from Europe in previous centuries, and in more recent decades you see highest numbers of immigrants from Latin America and Asia. And here's the foreign-born population by region of birth from 1960 to 2010. So these tables and figures, they complement each other. In this case here we also see the numbers in millions, and from Europe we see a decline in the number of foreign-born population from Europe, and a huge increase from those from Latin America and the Caribbean, and also an increase from Asia. And from other areas, it's not really easy to see here, but this number also increased from other areas. But as we saw in the previous table, the numbers increased a lot for immigrants born in Asia and also Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is the annual number of legal US immigrants by decade and region of origin from 1960 to 2009. So we see that back in 1960 and 1969, the majority of this, the legal US immigrants here, of course, in the country, they were from Europe and Canada, 49%. This is Europe and Canada here. And only 39% were from Latin America, 11% from Asia, and 1% from other regions. And the share of those legal US immigrants start to increase for those from Latin America. So they reached like 51% in 1990, 1999, and declined a little bit in 2000, 2009. And also important to see that the share of the Asian legal US immigrants increased a lot in the period from 11% to 34%, and from Europe and Canada you see a decline from 49% to 15%. And other regions increased, and as we saw in the previous table, we see also an increase from immigrants from Africa, and they are included in this group here. So you see an increase in Latin Americans, but they have a reduction in percentage terms among the legal US immigrants. Here we are not considering this graph the undocumented immigrants. So this graph here focuses on the legal US immigrants, and you see this variation on the region of origin of these people. And this is also from another article that I included in the figure in our lecture here. And this is an interesting tool that the Migration Policy Institute provide online, and you can check this. You can create your own graph by selecting whatever countries you want here from this menu. And if you want to check it out, you can just go directly to this website here. And in this case, I selected Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, because we have been hearing a lot in the media about the increase of immigrants from North Central America, specifically from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And yeah, they have been increasing a lot in these last decades. And we also hear a lot about immigrants coming from this country, usually like immigrant children coming from these countries without their parents. But still, we see that the number of immigrants from Mexico are still much higher than from these Central American countries. And the overall number of immigrants from Mexico increased a lot in the 90s and also 2000s, but then in more recent years, the overall number in millions declined. And here select these three countries in Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and also Mexico from North America. But in the following graphs, I will choose countries from other regions in the world, but I will always keep Mexico selected just to have the same vertical scale here up to 12 million immigrants. So just to be comparable graphs across these slides. So in the next one here, I chose China and India and keep Mexico selected just to have the same scale here. And we see that also the number of immigrants from China and India have been increasing a lot in these last decades, in these last years. And a lot of researchers, including Dudley Poston, the author of the textbook, he mentions that a lot of these immigrants from China and India, they might be in the future the ones taking the jobs, of the lowest skilled jobs that nowadays are being taken by Mexican immigrants. So his hypothesis is that lowest skilled immigrants from China and India, or mostly from China, might be the ones in the future taking lowest skilled jobs that are now being performed by Mexican immigrants. So these are hypotheses that he has been doing in several of his studies that we can try to evaluate as we move on in the next decades. The next graph here, I selected countries that used to have higher levels of immigration in the past to the US, but then it declined in more recent years, such as Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And of course, the data here provided by the Migration Policy Institute goes back only until 1960. If we could go back even further, as we saw in previous figures, the migration from Germany and UK, of course, was much higher. But then we see this is just to show that the levels of recent immigration from these countries, Germany and UK, and also Canada, are declining and becoming much smaller in recent years in comparing to Mexican immigration to the country. In this one here, I select these four African countries: Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. These are countries they are in West Africa, and they are all they all have English as their first language. So they're all West African countries and having English as their first language. And why I selected these specific ones here is to show that we don't have data that goes back until 1960, but we see an increase on the number of immigrants from Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. So again, these are West African countries with English as the first language. And I have been doing, I mentioned before in previous lectures related to this chapter, that I'm doing an analysis about Nigerian immigrants in the US. And actually, this project that I'm conducting also analyzes immigrants from Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And our idea is to see if people coming from these West African countries that have English as their first language, and exactly because they already know English, and whether they have a better levels of integration into the country, into the US after they get in here, and that in terms of education, in terms of jobs and earnings that they make in the country. But of course, these immigrants from Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, they are really different from each other. Usually, immigrants coming from Ghana and Nigeria, they have better levels of education and also better jobs. And then when they moved here, their children, so the first immigrants from Ghana and Nigeria, as I mentioned before, the ones who were born in those countries, they are first generation immigrants in the US. And their children are second generation immigrants. Their children are born in the US, but their parents are from Ghana and Nigeria. And exactly because their parents have better levels of education and earnings on average, their children are more likely as a second generation to have good levels of education and earnings. And so what we analyze is whether that's true or not compared to non-Hispanic whites. And but the problem is that their overall numbers have been increasing over time, but it's still, whenever we are using data from the current population survey, in the current population survey, the sample size of this group is small. So it's always a challenge to see whether these people are actually improving their lives as second generation compared to third generation non-Hispanic whites. And Liberians and Sierra Leones, usually immigrants from those countries, they have lower education and earnings than immigrants from Ghana and Nigeria. So we first started the project grouping the immigrants from these four countries, but then we started to focus more on Ghana and Nigeria, and more recently, mostly on immigrants from Nigeria. And this is another graph also that comes from the textbook. That's the foreign-born population by country of birth, just to show that the immigrants born in Mexico are still a really large population, almost 12 million people, and they are 29% of the total foreign-born population in the US. So although we saw in previous graphs that the numbers of immigrants from Mexico declined in more recent years, the overall number of immigrants from Mexico, it's still really high, and it's pretty much like 30% of the total foreign-born population in the country, even in more recent years. So immigration has a major effect on the size, distribution, and composition of the US population. And we discussed in previous chapters that fertility and mortality are relatively low in the US. And immigration's role in the growth of the population has increased a lot in these last years. So just as an example, immigration contributed to around 30% of the total population increase between 1980 and 2000. So we saw before the share of the foreign-born population in the US, it's around 13-14%, but they contributed to around 30% of the total population increase between 1980 and 2000, exactly because immigrants, they tend to have higher fertility than US-born population. And the number of foreign-born U.S. residents increased from 40 million in 1980 to 36 million in 2005. And here a graph just to show the increase in the US born and foreign born population from 1980 to 2005. These numbers are in millions, so this is the overall size of the US population. And of course, the US born population increased, the population as a whole increases, but we see huge increase in the foreign born population from 14 to 36 million, and this is related to graphs that I showed you before at the beginning of this lecture. And in terms of percentage increase, you see that, yeah, the US born population increased from 213 million back in 1980 to 253 million in 2005. But this percentage, in terms of percentage increase, this was 7.7% increase from 1980 to 1990, and 9.3% increase from 1990 to 2000. And when we consider the foreign-born population within itself, they increase 40% between 1980 and 1990, and 55% between 1990 and 2000. And the foreign-born share of increase was 30%, as I mentioned in the previous slide, from 1980 to 2000. So they are contributing a lot to the increase of the overall population in the US. And looking at the foreign-born population by state, and this information here is in percent of the foreign-born population on the overall population in each one of those states. So you see that California, Nevada, Texas, Florida, New Jersey, New York, for example, they have at least 15% of their population is foreign-born. And then in other states you see lower shares. But for example, for these states here with lower percentage of their population formed by foreign-born individuals, in the next graph you see that they had actually the highest percentage increase of foreign-born population between 2000 and 2005. So here we have the percent growth. Although they still have low percentage overall of foreign-born population in their states, they actually have increasing a lot the share of foreign-born population. So, for example, if a specific state has only 1% of foreign-born population, it increase to 2% in the next year, it's 100% increase. So exactly because they have lower percentage, as we saw in the previous graph, like in states located like in the southern US, when they increase a little bit, we see this high percentage increase between 2000 and 2005. So it's important to see the previous map in conjunction with this map here to see that exactly those states that have lower percentage of the overall foreign-born population considering the state population, they have increasing a lot the share of foreign-born population in these recent years. This map here kind of shows the migration flow of the number of legal immigrants flowing to each state between 2003 and 2012. And these numbers here are in like absolute numbers. So we see California and Florida, for example, and New Jersey as well, or sorry, New York State receiving at least more than 1 million or at least 1 million immigrants between 2003 and 2012. And Texas received between 500,000 and a little less than 1 million within this period. So this is pretty much the flow. How many people moved to these states, like legal immigrants moving to these states between 2003 and 2012. And in terms of the migration stock, after all the previous flows that these states received of foreign-born population, how many foreign-born population, what's the amount of foreign-born population that they have right now in this example in 2012. And here, this information is given in percentage terms. So you see California, Nevada, and Florida, for example, having at least 20% of population formed by foreign-born, and you see that in this case we are talking about a stock in a specific time. What's the percentage or what's the amount, could be in absolute terms as well, of people born in other countries that are living in these specific states. And in terms of projections, also from this information from another paper, the Census Bureau projections point to continued increases in the foreign-born population in the next decades. So by 2060, it is expected that the foreign-born proportion will reach nearly 20% of the population, and the non-Hispanic whites, they will have fallen to less than 50% of the population. So we discussed before in our course, this is what demographers call a majority-minority population. So the US, if we group together all the minority groups, they will be the majority of the population. So we get all the minority groups in the US, group them all together in the same group, they will be more than 50% of the population, so non-Hispanic whites will be less than 50%. And most of these minority groups are immigrants from Latin America and Asia. But it's important also to say here, this concept of majority-minority can be a little controversial because we are grouping together a series of different minority groups that are not really related to each other and have really different experiences living here in the US. So Latin American immigrants, Asian immigrants, African immigrants, and more recent immigrants and immigrants that have been here for generations, they are not really, the way that they integrate to the American society, the chances that they have to integrate in the American society vary a lot. So this concept of majority-minority is just to say that the non-Hispanic whites will be less than 50% of the population. But the other side of the population, which is all these minority groups putting together, and they will be at least more than 50% of the population, they are a really heterogeneous group. So we have to be careful when we analyze that, because this majority group formed by a series of minority groups, they are really different from each other. And an estimated 11 million persons are undocumented in the US. This is about 25% of the current foreign-born total in the country. And we have been seeing in more recent years that annual deportations from this group of undocumented immigrants have approached or exceeded 400,000 per year. So it has been increasing a lot in these last years. And here we have the US population by race and ethnicity group. So in this case here, we don't have information, we are not showing information about being foreign-born and US-born. It's pretty much showing the race ethnicity of people in the US. And you see that the share of the non-Hispanic white population has been decreasing from 1970 to 2010, and it's projected to keep decreasing by 2050. And we saw in the previous slide that projections show that there will be less than 50% by 2060. And that year, 2060, varies from different demographers from different institutions doing these projections. And we see an increase in the share of the Hispanic population, around 30% expected by 2050, and Black population kind of stable over time, 11, 13, and 13%, and the Asian population increasing from 1% to 6%, expected to increase to 6% by 2050. An important topic whenever I talk about immigrants is related to immigrant integration. Many migrants from Mexico and Central America enter the US with low levels of education and also with little English proficiency. But children of immigrants are seen to have converged substantially to native-born averages in broad array of domains. So although immigrants from Mexico and Central America have low education levels and little English proficiency, their children, the children of migrants, these are the second generation immigrants, they usually improve a lot their education levels, English proficiency, and they tend to have similar indicators, level in these indicators as the US born population. Which indicators exactly we are talking? We are talking about education attainment, overall earnings, occupation, and also lower levels of poverty, higher levels of residential integration, and higher English proficiency. So although first generation immigrants from Mexico and Central America have low levels of education and also not as good levels of a series of other socioeconomic indicators, second generation immigrants, they tend to improve in a series of different socioeconomic indicators. However, so these people, these second generation immigrants, are having a good integration to the country that improve a series of their indicators. But integration also produces declines in other areas. So, for example, usually first generation immigrants overall, they have better health than US born population. And we talked already about this, about the Hispanic paradox. So we would expect that exactly because these immigrants from Mexico and Central America and South America as well, they have lower levels of education, we would expect them to have lower levels of health. But because of nutrition, because of the cultural habits that they have, because of family support, they tend to have good health, although they have lower levels of education, lower levels of earnings compared to the US born population. So they have lower levels of a series of socioeconomic indicators, but they have better health. So that's the Hispanic paradox. But what happens is that the second generation immigrants, the children, when they integrate to the country, then their health starts being closer to the US born population health. So their health declines. And also, first generation immigrants usually have lower levels of crimes compared to US born population. But then the children of immigrants, those born in the US, but they have parents from elsewhere, then their crime rates start to increase and start to be closer to the US born population. And we'll show you a graph in the next slides about this. And family stability, it's also declines for children of immigrants compared to first generation immigrants. And this process of immigrant integration, it varies by race ethnicity. So integration with native-born non-Hispanic whites is fastest for Asian immigrants, slower for Latino immigrants, slowest for Black immigrants, and especially difficult for undocumented individuals. So undocumented individuals have the lowest levels of immigrant integration compared, so they get their socioeconomic status are still farther away from non-Hispanic whites. And socioeconomic indicators looking at all these different areas that we discussed here before. And just to give you an idea of the education attainment of the US born and the recently arrived foreign born Americans by education. So here, for the foreign born, they're recently here, the foreign born are those who entered the US after 1999. So you see that the US born population, only 12% of them have less than high school. And this is the percentage of population aged at least 25 years. But the foreign born population, you have much higher percent of those who have less than high school. And because of that, with the US population, you have much higher percent of those with at least high school or some college, and only 35% of the foreign-born have high school or some college. But the foreign-born population also, they have a little more, a higher percentage of those with at least a bachelor degree compared to US-born population. But overall, we see that the foreign-born population, a really high percentage of them, of those recent immigrants, they have a higher percentage with less than high school. In terms of the language spoken at home by the US foreign-born population, 46% of them speak Spanish, 16% English only, and so on, 17% other Indo-European languages, 18% Asian or Pacific Island languages. So you see that still a lot of these immigrants speak non-English language at home, for 46% of them. And but so that's to show that still a lot of these immigrants did not integrate fully to the culture, but at the same time it's good for them to maintain their cultural habits, their language knowledge from the countries where they come from. So although we saw in the previous graph that the education attainment of recent foreign-born population is lower than the US-born population, here these numbers here are clear, we also have to consider that international migrants in the US are positively self-selected. So in this, this author here mentioned that immigrants to the US, they are actually, most of them coming to the US, they are usually more highly motivated than the average population in their origin countries. And we are talking about highly motivated in economic terms. So that's why he calls that American immigrants, the American, they have this that brings how exceptional America is, because America is bringing immigrants that are better on average, economically speaking, than the population of their home countries. So they usually have higher levels of education and they usually have higher levels of training compared to the average in their home countries. We saw in the previous graph that, okay, they have a higher percentage of the foreign-born population has less than high school compared to the US-born population. But if you compare this foreign-born population to their population of their origin countries, they have better socioeconomic indicators, including education. So legal and undocumented international migrants to the US are less likely to commit serious crimes and to be imprisoned compared to the native US-born population. So this is really interesting data, and you usually hear in the media and series of public discourse that immigrants have been perceived as threats in all this political and public discourse, but data shows that they are less likely to commit serious crimes and to be imprisoned compared to US-born population. And here we have data from the Pew Research Center, and we have data for first and second generation immigrants. And this is, here we have the prevalence of each group involved in at least one crime in the previous 12 months. So it takes into account the size of each one of these groups. So first generation immigrants, these are those people who were born in another country and now are living in the US. Second generation, they were born in the US, but their parents were born in another country, as I explained to you before. And native born are those who were born in the US and at least their parents were also born in the US. So what you see, that first generation immigrants, the foreign born population, those born in other countries but now are living in the US, they have lower chances of committing crime for all these different age groups. And the native born population has the highest levels. And what we talked before, the second generation, the children of immigrants, these guys here are born in the US, but their parents are born in other countries. And they integrate so much to the American society that their levels of crime get closer, much closer to the level of crime of the native born population. So the second generation, the children of immigrants, as I mentioned before, they improve in terms of education, earnings, lower levels of poverty, higher levels of residential integration compared to these guys. But they also lose. They also lose in terms of overall health because they start to have the similar cultural habits as the native-born population, bad diet, and so on. And they also lose in terms of crime, in terms of having higher chances of committing crime. So the public discourse saying that immigrants usually are more likely to commit crimes, it's not true based on all these different data that have been collected. And this is data from the Pew Research Center that you can access directly from this website. So here, related to those public attitudes toward immigration, the public attitudes and perceptions toward immigration and questions about the social and economic impacts of immigrants are linked. So all these discussions that we have in public and the perceptions that we have toward immigrants, it shapes our questions about the socioeconomic impacts of immigrants. If I perceive immigrants as having higher chances of committing crimes, then I will think that immigrants have negative socioeconomic impacts into the American society. But the truth is, as we saw as an example in the previous graph, is that immigrants have lower chances of committing crimes. So by looking at data and seeing that immigrants have lower chance of committing crimes, then I will actually say that actually the socioeconomic impacts of immigrants into the American society actually might be positive. So the fortunes of immigrants and their effects on the economy, political system, schools, and society shape public opinion on additional immigration. So usually all the effects that these immigrants have in all these different areas in our society will shape what other people think about immigrants themselves and what about we should increase immigration furthermore to the country. And usually states that already have a high percentage of foreign-born population, as we saw in previous maps, they usually tend to have a more positive perception about immigrants because they're already used to those immigrants in their lives, surrounding them and living close to each other because they see the positive effects of immigrants to the society as a whole. Those areas that usually have lower percentage of immigrants and then you see a percentage growth of immigrants in more recent years, those people are not really used to immigrants. They tend to have more negative perceptions. And these negative perceptions, again, are not linked to real data as we saw in the previous graph. It's much more about perceptions. It's much more about this public discourse. Okay, so that's important too. So there are a lot of literature discussing these issues. So the discourse typically links undocumented immigrants to terrorism. However, terrorist attacks have not been committed by undocumented immigrants. So although the public discourse says, oh, we should secure the southern border because undocumented immigrants are linked to terrorism, when we look at historical data, terrorist attacks have not been committed by undocumented immigrants. And this data here was organized by this researcher from the RAND Corporation. And this is data that he organized back in 2016. And here it's showing the migration status of all these immigrants that, or people who committed these different terrorist attacks. So all these immigrants or US born population. That's what I mean, like all these people, either immigrants or US born population. So for all these different attacks here, they were committed by people who entered the US lawfully or were permanent residents. And these attacks here were tried to be committed by people who were carrying concealed explosives in their plane. So these are examples of people who were entering the US by airplane, carrying all these concealed explosives, but exactly because they were coming from in airplanes, they had a visa. They had a visa to enter the U.S. through all these their flights that they were coming in. So they were immigrants coming with their visa, but they were documented. They were not undocumented. And some of the hijackers of the 9/11 attacks, they were visa overstays, so they committed violations by staying here longer than what they were supposed to stay. But again, they had visas, they were documented, and no terrorist attack was committed by undocumented immigrants. So these people here, undocumented immigrants, they did not commit any terrorist attack. And all these other terrorist attacks were committed by people who were lawfully, they entered the US lawfully or were permanent residents or other kind of immigrants that had their visas. So immigrants and terrorism, we usually have a discourse in the public opinion that undocumented immigration could increase terrorism, but this data here shows that's not the case. Okay, so thank you very much, and that's what I had to talk about the specific topic within international migration. Thank you.